Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for attending today's event made at the library Francis Oldham Kelsey and the Battle Against Thalidomide, a book talk organized by the Library of Congress Manuscript Division. I'm Josh Levy, and I'm the historian of science and technology for the Manuscript Division and the curator of the Francis Kelsey papers here at the library. Joining me for our discussion today is Dr. Cheryl Krasnick Warsh and Loretta Deaver. Loretta, my co-host, is a reference librarian in the Manuscript Division, where she has worked for 6 years. She assists researchers in person and remotely and has authored guides to the division's collections related to LGBTQ+ topics and the US Supreme Court. Cheryl Krasnick Warsh is a professor of history at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, Canada. Dr. Warsh has published books on the history of asylums, women's health, children's health, consumerism, and alcohol and drug use. She served as long-term editor-in-chief of the Canadian Bulletin of Medical History and was co-editor of Gender in History. Dr. Warsh was a Fulbright Fellow, AMS Hanna Fellow, and the inaugural recipient of the Vancouver Island University Distinguished Researcher Award. In 2017, she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada for her contributions to Canadian medical history. Her book, Francis Oldham Kelsey, The FDA and the Battle Against Thalidomide, published this year by Oxford University Press, is a new biography of Dr. Francis Kelsey, the Canadian-born FDA pharmacologist and physician, best known for preventing the deadly sedative thalidomide from entering the US market. And for those unfamiliar with that story, in the early 1960s, Dr. Kelsey was tasked with reviewing Merrill Pharmaceuticals' approval application for thalidomide. But after careful review, she became increasingly unconvinced of the drug's safety. For 19 months, Kelsey held her ground and continued her investigations as pregnant mothers outside the US received prescriptions for thalidomide, many thousands of them, resulting in at least 10,000 children across 46 countries born with severe deformities that included missing limbs, arms and legs resembling flippers, and improperly developed eyes, ears, and other organs. The resulting scandal and Kelsey's careful work led Congress to pass the 1962 Drug Amendment, which transformed the landscape of pharmaceutical regulation in the United States, requiring pharmaceutical companies to conduct phased clinical trials to obtain informed consent from participants in drug testing and to warn the FDA of adverse effects. Dr. Warsh's biography provides new insight into this story and to Kelsey's subsequent elevation as one of the most celebrated women and scientists in the United States. But she also highlights Kelsey's subsequent decades-long career with the FDA, including her later campaigns to protect consumers from suspect drugs like DES and Latril, and provides a window into Kelsey's personal life, using interviews with family and colleagues, private family papers, and archival collections like the Manuscript Division's Francis Kelsey papers.
Thank you, Josh. Before we hear from Dr. Warsh, I wanted to say a brief word about the Kelsey papers and to highlight an item that might help set the tone for today's conversation. The Kelsey papers consist of over 250 containers, combining materials transferred from the FDA's History Office in Part 1 and items donated by Dr. Kelsey's daughters, Susan Duffield and Christine Kelsey, in Part 2. Each part contains distinct series based on the documents that make up Kelsey's papers, including but not limited to a speeches and writing series, research file, correspondence, and a personal file. The collection even contains a series of born digital files, computer files that can be viewed on dedicated machines in the manuscript reading room. You can read much more about the content and arrangement of Dr. Kelsey's papers in the collection's finding aid, which we'll link in the chat. Importantly, I want to note that the Kelsey papers are stored in an off-site facility. So if you'd like to visit and access the papers, you should contact the manuscript reading room at least 2 business days before your planned visit. Staff is also available and happy to assist you via phone or ask a librarian. There are some wonderful personal letters from the public to Dr. Kelsey described in Dr. Warsh's book. I located this letter from a 4th grade class in Newark, Delaware, asking Dr. Kelsey if she has any memories of her time in 4th grade for a project. The students write, "Mrs. Hughes, our teacher, says we have leaders of tomorrow in our class today, even if we don't recognize them." So let's launch into our Q&A discussion with Professor Warsh, after which we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, not the chat. The chat will serve as a space for the host to post relevant links and to resources. So now, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Josh and Professor Warsh.
Thanks, Loretta, and thanks, Professor Warsh, for joining us today. The first question that I wanted to ask, although you have written a book that is about people, it's a question about animals. Animals are really significant actors in this story, and I wonder if you could talk about the intersection between professional pharmacology's increasing demand for animal testing, the animal rights movement, and then Kelsey's own personal relationships with animals.
Well, thank you, Josh. And I just want to say thank you, Josh and Loretta, for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. Yeah, Animals is a story that runs right through, and it really, in some ways, is a paradox because the people who are quite fond of animals are also experimenting on animals. And there was a great deal of pushback from the public over various decades. Pharmacologists work with animals. They had to be comfortable with animals. Personally, Dr. Kelsey loved animals, but she experimented on them for the greater good of scientific advancement. She was a scientist, but she also grew up on a gentleman's farm. So she had a farmer's perspective on the place of animals in an agricultural setting. That you could name your cow and raise your cow and then put them in the freezer and eat them at Christmas. So she took part in a whale hunt in the 1930s for scientific research. Of course, whale hunts were one of the first projects that were professions, I guess, that were targeted because so quickly these intelligent mammals were losing their numbers. But she also retained a very abiding interest in the movement for preserving the whale population. And the way she looked at it, and her colleagues, was that, and I agreed with this, is that the more scientific research was done on the animals, the more the public would know about them and care about them. And you see in the papers, she includes stories about the whale songs as communications, for instance. One thing that was interesting about the animal rights movement is that one of the time periods and places where it was very strong was in the 1940s in Chicago, and the University of Chicago, where she was at for many years, and which was one of the centers of scientific research, was targeted by the Hearst papers. And there was a great deal of pushback from the public. And in some ways, it was rightly so, because some of the animal facilities at the University of Chicago were very abysmal. And the president, Robert Hutchins, worked with scientists such as her mentor, Eugene Geiling, to establish the first protocols on animal testing. And that's what we have now. The same as testing on humans, we have protocols for testing on animals. But ultimately, the problem existed that the alternative to testing drugs on animals was to test them on people first. And so as the higher species and the ones doing the testing, we chose the animals first.
Mm-hmm. And then you tell some stories about Kelsey's own pets, I think, as well, that put a little bit of a different spin on the story.
She loved cats. And she had one cat that was, when she was very young, it was quite funny. She had a cat that that scratched her very severely and scarred her, and the parents threw the cat out, got rid of the cat, and said the cat had died. And then months later, the cat came back, and so they had to let her keep the cat. There's pictures, I think there's one in the book I don't know how this came about, but there was a bird sitting on her head when she was young. They got a picture of that, which I thought was pretty impressive because it took time to take pictures in the early 20th centuries, and the bird just sat there for the whole picture. And they always had, they had dogs, and they had all kinds of wildlife. And then they did research, she and her husband in the Chicago lab did research on chickens, and then the leftover chickens got to be a barbecue for the staff. So yeah, so animals always were a very important part of their lives.
Yeah. Can I ask you about Sherry Chesson? You tell her story in chapter 11 of the book. She was a children's show host known as Miss Sherry. You describe her as, quote, the epitome of Cold War domesticity and someone whose experiences became a catalyst for the attainment of legal access to abortion in America. How do you situate Kelsey and the thalidomide story within that longer history of abortion access in the United States and beyond?
Well, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to Miss Sherry, who is still alive. She's a powerhouse in her late 90s, and her daughter, Chris Atwell, is doing a documentary on her and getting the story back into the abortion debate in America. In terms of the way the public looked at it, I think there was a really good quote by a Canadian father whose wife had taken thalidomide, and he said, "If my wife gave birth to a disabled child through an act of God, we would accept it. However, it was due to a poison sold freely as a drug. It would be a bitter pill to swallow."
Mhm.
And I think that really was the game changer. That once the trust was broken between women and their physicians, women and their government, the drug companies, it became a case of stay out of my womb.
Mhm.
You don't know what's best for me, and I demand the right and the opportunity to do what's best for me and my future children.
Mhm.
And Dr. Kelsey's story also brought the experience, and this was very important in the broader picture, the experience of pregnancy, which was still seen as very private and very domestic, into the light, into the glare of the light, and encouraged women to talk about their own experiences of unwanted pregnancies, of miscarriages, of stillbirths, of infertility, and of disabilities, and not as individual tragedies and as personal failures, but as challenges that the medical profession and the state had to address for all women.
Mhm.
And I think that's why what she did and all the speeches she made and Dr. Helen Tossig made about what women should do during pregnancy, avoiding drugs, staying healthy, all this kind of thing, and that there are poisons out there that can affect the fetus and you may not know about it. It really did bring it out in the open that this is a situation and a problem that the whole society has to deal with, and not just individual women.
Yeah. So at the point in the story where Kelsey has very carefully through research over many months has been looking into the safety of thalidomide, has also been pushing back against all the pressures within the FDA and from the pharmaceutical industry to approve thalidomide. She's become elevated as this kind of national figure. You write about Kelsey being depicted in the media as what you call a good mother of science, a mother protector whose quote unquote innate motherly instincts were as responsible for her success as her scientific ability was. Could you talk more about that sort of gendered depiction of Kelsey as seen in the media and then in her kind of public interactions, and the place of that image within the Cold War anxieties of the 1960s, and then how that affected Kelsey professionally and personally?
That's always been that was a lot of fun to read some of those letters and the articles, and how members of the press, mostly male, but there were some women, really had a hard time getting their heads around the fact that this scientist was female, this regulator was female, and that it must really be, it is a story about women, therefore it must be her innate motherly instinct that made her do all these great things. And they used really awkward terms. My favorite was the knightess. The knightess. She was a knightess in shining armor. And I think, oh, I can't believe an editor didn't get rid of that one. So the journalists comb phrases. They call her the plain Jane. Well, you know, she was very, and she wasn't a plain Jane. She was a lady who was in her 40s, and they called her messy because they were looking for something that she wasn't so perfect. And of course, she relied on her husband. And she did discuss many of the anomalies with her husband, who was also a pharmacologist, but it wasn't that her husband made the decision in the background. but they were always trying to fit her into the appropriate gender roles. But it was the right image in the right time for many people, especially women, because the Cold War was the height of anxieties about what male science had wrought, what male militarism had wrought. And this led to a lot of positive feelings about Dr. Kelsey. She was the good mother of science, and we could count on her because she was actually a mother, and we could trust her innately. She also was a superb communicator on the lecture circuit. And she said at the outset, she said that her mom, who had been an amateur actress on the London stage in her younger days, had taught her about public speaking and comportment. And she was able to use these things. And also she loved to travel. She loved that, and I think that she did say it in her papers that the only place she had never been to, the only continent, was Antarctica. So she loved the travel. She loved going around. What she found exhausting was that she had a full caseload and did everything while they were sending her out on these trips. But the FDA was able to ride her personal popularity to expand the much needed regulatory capabilities. They were able to use the popular goodwill and her natural flair of both being confident and yet being extremely humble. And I think that this was an excellent persona to really promote confidence among the population. And as well, you saw from that first article that the students did, the inspirational aspect of it. And in one article on a visit she gave to a women's college, this was one of the early ones, a student gushed to the reporter, said she was just like someone's mom. And that was, we understand that now because women are, have so many roles in public at the same time. But this was entirely new persona for a female scientist. Most female scientists were not able to do their career and have a family at the same time because it was just too difficult. Or there was always an unspoken or perhaps spoken prescriptions against showing that you have a family. That makes you too female. You're trying to just be the scientist first. So for most female public figures, the idea of being able to act like a mom while still being accepted for your professional expertise was quite new, and she really handled that balance quite well.
So you just mentioned the FDA at times sort of riding the coattails of her celebrity. And Kelsey is probably best remembered now as a kind of American heroine of science, or a face of a federal agency, or a face of the FDA. But could you talk about her significance to the history of Canada as well, and what you think her story tells us about Canadian history, or about the sometimes porous boundary between Canada and the United States?
Canada doesn't do well in this narrative. Speaking as a Canadian, not well at all. Thalidomide was unleashed by the same companies, Merrill as well. There were a couple Canadian companies, but they did get it from the same place. And Canada was seen as part of the North American market, so that Canada was seen as part of the traveling drug salesman circuit. And it was extremely exploited and all over the country. I believe that the number of Canadian thalidomide cases has been seriously underestimated. And as all thalidomide cases, because when we think of thalidomide, we're just thinking of the external horrific side effects, as you mentioned, the arms that were missing and all. But there were so many internal organ issues. There was heart problems. But there was learning disabilities. There were so many problems, however, that couldn't legally be traced to thalidomide. And so we really have no sense of it. But what I found striking is that originally, when I looked at Canada, you assumed that this was a drug that was prescribed in mostly Montreal and Toronto, in the big centers. And yet I'm on the West Coast, and when I give this talk, I've spoken to women from the prairie provinces, from small towns, from British Columbia, who were personally offered the drug, or whose moms or sisters were offered thalidomide for morning sickness, and there, but for the grace of God, didn't take it. And so, or asked for it, and the doctor said, no, this is terrible, you're not touching that drug. So that was a good part. But it penetrated the entire country. Just a few weeks ago, I met a retired nurse who worked in the early 1960s at the Montreal General Hospital. And she said there were 500 cases in the crippled children's ward in Montreal and another 500 cases in Toronto. And these were not big cities. I mean, these are an incredible number of cases. And again, these are just the cases that had the problems that needed the special help. So that's a big number. What took it from being in Canada a tragedy to reprehensible was the responses of the governments, and by the Canadian Constitution, the British North America Act at this point, that there's a split in jurisdiction, that healthcare was seen as a provincial jurisdiction, but any external trade and regulation, such as a drug trade coming from other countries, was federal. And the governments were very active in shifting the blame on each other. And saying at one point at the beginning, when the cases started coming out, saying, oh, well, the kids that are disabled are just going to be part of the crippled children, it's provincial dispute. And so there was a few politicians on the opposition that came out and said, J.S. Woodsworth was one of them, saying that this is ridiculous because you brought this drug in, and so you let it come in. The other part that was reprehensible was the Canadian Drug Directorate. And that is, I believe I labeled this chapter Circling Their Wagons, because again, they were looking, well, they actually said, one of the head of the Canadian Drug Directorate at the time, said, well, and this is after the stories came out, and Kelsey, one of the first things she did was send a report to the Canadian Drug Directorate in Ottawa saying, watch this drug, there's a problem with it, and they didn't do anything. And then after the fact, when they were questioned by the press, why didn't you do anything? And they said, well, at that point, and even to this point, there aren't any cases in Canada yet, so it's not a problem. And just that, well, we have this wonderful border, like viruses, and germs. It's not going to cross the border. That's in the States, and the drugs aren't here, and we don't have cases here. And of course, the cases came very soon afterwards. So that aspect, it was still, the reporters found the drugs still on the shelves in pharmacies a year and a half later. And one of the pharmacists they interviewed said, well, it's still good for men, isn't it? And seeing that drugs are shared in a household, and if there's a poison, you get it out. And just that attitude to give a little bit of an excuse to the drug directorate. It was a very like in Canada, in the States, but even worse, they had very few members in the department. It was a very small department. They never really had gotten into this whole late 20th century huge drug approval process yet. And they only had a few full-time scientists working on it. They had a bunch of part-time people, and they really weren't prepared for it. But I don't know, the way I looked at it is, so fall on your sword and just say so, as opposed to saying, well, it wasn't our problem and it's not a problem, and just shifting the blame on somebody else.
Those are fantastic responses. I think we're ready to turn things over to Loretta. Loretta has some questions that are a little bit more process oriented about your research here.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Professor Warsh, for being here. Yeah, I have some questions about your archival research experience, but first, what's in a name? Kelsey herself wrote that she may not have received an opportunity to work and study at the University of Chicago if her name had been Elizabeth or Mary Jane. Do you believe she may have lost more opportunities if her name was not Frances?
This is one of the apocryphal stories, how Dr. Geiling assumed, who would be her thesis advisor in Chicago when she applied, that Francis was a man. And she asked him later on, and he would never really admit it. Having said that, knowing from all of this, and I must say that Dr. Geiling is one of my heroes in the story. He was the mentor extraordinaire for so many people, including the Kelseys. And I think that if there had been a follow-up, if he said, well, I'm not hiring a woman, and if she had written him again, or, I'm sure he would have given her the chance. I just do. Having said that, there was an awful lot of glass ceilings that she hit all along the way, which is why she didn't get that permanent job until her 40s. And she was getting frustrated as she watched her colleagues who graduated with her after her getting jobs in universities, and she didn't. And there always was a reason, but there wasn't a reason, because she was a woman and not getting the jobs. And so that was a constant. She knew it. What was nice in her later career, and as you follow the career, as more and more women are in FDA, you can see that she has great relationships with them. She was mentoring them. She was, that she would go out and encourage young women to go into STEM. She was very active in promoting science for girls. So she was always giving back.
Thank you so much. Much of your previous work has focused on earlier periods. How was the process of researching the biography of a living person different? How did you come into contact with Kelsey and her family and arrange meetings with Dr. Kelsey?
It's a lot easier when the people are dead, let me tell you. Yeah, so I had written a book called Prescribed Norms, which was a textbook on women's health. And when I was researching the chapter on birth and went into birth defects, I found thalidomide, I found Dr. Kelsey, and it said that she was from Cobble Hill, Canada, which is 40 miles up the road from me. And I said, whoa. And so I looked her up, and doing some great historical research, and I found that she was still in the Maryland phone directory. And I called up, I spoke to the caregiver, who said that you have to talk to the daughters. And I started communicating with Sue and Chris, who I just want to give a shout out. They were incredibly patient. This is a long process. They were incredibly helpful. One of my favorite memories when I was working, I think the last time in the reading room, and I think Melinda Friend, who was doing the collection, was there, is that while I was going through the papers I would be talking, for instance, I found a letter from a relative, a sister-in-law or something. And so I wrote an email to one of the sisters, and then a fax came in with their picture of who I was talking about. And Melinda went by and said, what is that? And I said, oh, I'm getting all kinds of, I've got Sue and Chris at the other end. So they were really, really helpful. And whatever documents you'll get from them will be wonderful. Sue did an incredible, this is really a great moment. Sue did an incredible, and she's still doing, organizational job. She has at her place, she lives in Washington State, and she has this kind of a garage where she has all the files, letters, and everything's curated, everything's organized. And then upstairs, when I visited her, my husband and I, she had us stay upstairs. It was very nice. But in the middle of the night, the wolves were howling all night, and it was just such an experience. I felt like I was back at the Kelsey farm on Cobble Hill, because I'm sure there was some wolves howling there at night in the old days.
Oh my gosh, what a journey. The Kelsey papers at the library are a bit unusual in that the FDA, especially FDA historian John Swan, was so instrumental in assembling the collection. How was your experience working with the Kelsey papers, and what tips would you offer for other researchers who may be navigating them in the future?
The first thing I would say is take a lot of time. You're not getting it done in a day. It's a very big collection. It's going to be way easier for you than it was for me for the first few times before it was properly organized. And so much of it I was looking at were duplicates and triplicates of government forms. Other parts were almost like you were in somebody's attic and you were just going through rummaging through things. So that was fun, but it takes a long time, especially if you're living 3 time zones away. You can't just pop up whenever you want to. Much easier now. The Kelsey papers, I'm glad you showed the finding aid at the beginning. It was just an amazing finding aid. It's so helpful online, and it was so helpful when I had to hunt footnotes because the citations had changed from the original time I worked there. So it was really, really helpful. John Swan has been, well, he's also been incredibly helpful. His department in the history unit, the FDA, is a real credit to an institution that always has a sense of its own history. And it's just the idea that they have, this flourishing historical department. It's just speaks to it. My favorite parts were often the little yellow notes that Dr. Kelsey would scribble to John when over the years her last job was to go through her entire collection with him. And so she'd comment on the individual items. She'd say, I'm saving this letter because this man did this and this. And many of those little quotes ended up in the book because they were so useful and they were in her voice and in her handwriting. So it's a lot easier collection to go through now, but it is a very big collection.
Thank you. You include detailed citations in the book that will make it easy for others to find the documents that you cite, in the library's Kelsey papers and beyond. How do you keep citation information organized as you're writing?
That is a really, really big challenge, especially when this was over 10 years. And often, because I went back to teaching, and so I'd only be writing in the summertime. And so I had to make sure that everything was organized. You have to write, you have to keep such good track of every single page. If you are printing it out or scanning and printing, it's easier because you can just write on the back of every single page what the numbers are. If you are by the third trip or second trip, I had a camera and I was just taking my own scans. You have to make sure that you take the original file folder first and then take it all. And even then, ideally, best practices, if you did that, is if you could bring with you your own personal printer, and when you're in the hotel room at night, print it all out while it's fresh and make sure it's really well organized. And page numbers, you can always count on if you have a big document at some point, it's going to fall on the ground. Everything's going to fly around. So you really have to be careful. So yeah, I mean, you really have to, the way I would look at it is that, and I just want to add this part too, it's kind of related. If there were students that were looking at the documents and don't know, and new researchers, it's not a library. You're not going in there and you look at things and take a couple notes and go home, because you don't know what you're missing, you don't know what you're going to need, and you don't know if you take notes, you're going to want the exact quote. So the best thing to do, which is what I did, which is so time consuming as well, is that for much of the collection, I literally rebuilt it. Is that I would print everything out, I put it in the orders, I put it in filing cabinets, and then you have the luxury of picking it up and putting it down. And there are actually a few files, not too many, hopefully, that I never looked at for the book, because at some point after 10 years, you have to stop, and maybe I'll get to it someday. Not important things, I hope, but little ones. But there was a very important one after the first set of the first draft to Oxford and the first set of suggestions. I went back and looked at the autopsy reports for the original thalidomide survey that Kelsey sent out to the public health departments of all the states, and they were heartbreaking, and they were part of a chapter on their own. right? But I had it there. And so when it was time to look at it, I had it right there to look at. And that's the important thing. You want everything with you physically at all times.
I can just picture it, the Warsh archive. Can you share with us any other projects that are coming out of the book?
Yeah, actually, it's very exciting. There is going to be, I was contacted by this really amazing group of people who have optioned the book for the year for making a feature film. And they are dealing with, they have people contributing financially as well as in terms of personal assistance who are thalidomide survivors, who are people interested in the topic, people interested in women's health. I find this, it's really great that Kelsey's story continues to have so much impact and resonate with so many people all these years later.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
We can open the discussion up to the audience for Q&A. And just as a reminder, please use the Q&A functions to submit your questions, not the chat. The chat is a space for us to post relevant links to resources. But before we do that, I did have one other question. And this question is based on, I think, probably a unique way in which our staff read books like this, in which we're always looking out for connection to other collections that we happen to have. So there are a few interesting intersections that I noticed, some of which are really wonderful, colorful stories. You describe a couple of interactions, interaction with Kelsey spotting an elderly Anna Kelton Wiley, who is squirreling away some cream chicken in her purse. You also talk about Donald Rumsfeld, whose papers we also have, stepping in as the CEO of GD Searle, following Kelsey's investigations of the company's aspartame studies. But I especially wanted to ask about Congresswoman Patsy Mink, unless you had comments that you wanted to make about either of those interactions. Mink appears in your chapter on DES. This is one of the drugs that Kelsey investigated following the thalidomide scandal. DES was a synthetic estrogen, and Mink was prescribed it unknowingly while she was in the hospital in 1951. And she later filed a lawsuit against Eli Lilly and the University of Chicago. Could we talk and just shift gears a little bit and talk about Mink and the way that DES impacted patients like her, and ways in which perhaps her encounter with that drug might have affected her subsequent advocacy and political life as the first woman of color in Congress?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked me about her. I did come to your talk that the Mink, I think it was her daughter and another researcher had written a book about her. DES, diethylstilbestrol. That was a story of good research gone bad. It had been touted as a wonder hormone by this couple, the Smiths, decided that this particular estrogen, when they were just doing the original work, that it was so helpful for women in pregnancy. They actually said that all women should take it as a preventative, almost like a vitamin in pregnancy. And it was so, I mean, it was touted to be so great that actually, that one researcher, William Diekman, stepped back and said a few years later, and he was at the University of Chicago, and he said that we're going to do a comprehensive study on it and see whether it really adds up in terms of how great it is and if there's any dangers at it. But it was a great idea, and he found really good findings, which is that it was dangerous and it didn't really help. But what he did, the research that Mink was at, he did it at this University of Chicago prenatal clinic, fraudulently telling women that the free drug, they were offered it for free, and said, you have a choice. You're here because you may have a problem pregnancy and you want to have the best outcome for your baby. And I am a doctor or a nurse in a white coat, and I'm here with you. And I can give you this drug for free. You can think of it sort of like a vitamin. And if you take it, it might help save your pregnancy. So this isn't exactly free choice, as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, this isn't a free choice. It's not proper consent. And so they would give the drug. They'd have to come every week, and they'd give them the drug right through their pregnancies, and then they would look at the results afterwards. And the thing with DES is that you may not see the consequences till the children of the DES takers, the ones who had it, the mothers, the children would be born with deformed uteri, the cervixes, the penises. It was absolutely horrific. And the treatment was horrific. I mean, they were just doing internal examinations on 6-year-old girls, and they described how, well, you have to have very small tools to use, and it was just awful. The whole experience was just awful. And she was part of this study. And when her daughter was born with a deformed cervix, and she got involved in the class action with other women, I think this had a huge formative effect in the sense that she had a choice. You know, you could sit home and cry, or you can seek justice for their families and for all families. And that is the path that Congresswoman Mink took and continued to take. So I think absolutely this was a launching pad for a very distinguished career.
Mhm. We have a wonderful broad question from an audience member about Kelsey's legacy. I wonder if you could talk about the legacy of her work personally, but also the legacy of thalidomide on things like, as you mentioned, public trust in institutions and corporations in the United States and globally, and then Kelsey's impact on the regulatory regime of the pharmaceutical industry in the United States.
Well, she had a great deal of impact for the last part of the question. It was a great deal of impact in terms of the publicizing of her actions really was the catalyst to bring about the drug reforms. And the thalidomide story, which was so incredibly unfair and horrific and global, really was the first real instruction to the world that drugs can be very, very dangerous, and also that the womb was not, as many physicians believed in the middle of the century, that the womb was almost like an iron safe, and nothing can get through it that the mothers took. And I think that one of the big legacies, I would hope, and especially for thinking young women, is that if there's a possibility you could get pregnant, you don't take anything. You don't take anything, you take your B vitamins, you do whatever you can. And you see, you see a healthcare professional, and you know that this is a very fragile process that you have to, you are the caretaker of. And you also, I think it really was the first indication to the population after decades of the great physician and, the great Dr. Kildare's and the great everything that saves us, and the great advances in science and medicine, that there is the dangerous side, and that every pill and everything you put into your body can have a negative effect. And I think this was a long-term effect that she promoted herself in terms of telling other people, and I think that other people are aware of. And the other part is, I think, about being the woman professional, the woman regulator, the whistleblower, the just that you just have to stand on your principles, and there's a reason for it, and to be firm in your principles, firm in your integrity, and I think that's why she continues to be a role model.
We have another question here that's somewhat related. And the question is, do you think misogyny played a role both in rolling out thalidomide and in the long road to repeal it, and maybe in Canada especially?
Absolutely. We could call it's misogyny. It's also, yeah, I guess that's what we would call it. It's just that women's lives were in some way not quite as important, that babies weren't really, not quite as important in many ways. Well, it's only been a few decades before you could perhaps lose a childbirth, right? And these things happen, and there's still infant mortality was still very high till the beginning of the 20th century. And the drug companies was just, and we see it in a few stories. I remember reading something about when, geez, what was it called? When the Rely tampon, I believe it was in the 70s, and it was It was a very, there were women that got really sick or died from it, from internal infections that came from the poison that had been put into the chlorine. The chlorine had been put into the crop of the cotton and all this kind of thing.
Mm.
And so there was a public outcry, and the government had a committee, and they had some women's health professionals and advocates, as well as the heads of the, you know, of Procter and Gamble and the various companies. And I remember reading one of the women's health advocates said, by about the third or the fourth meeting, the heads of the companies, the male heads, were getting very comfortable with each other.
Mm.
And they were just chatting about business and chatting about how we deal with these things. And it was just like, this is all going to pass. This is business as usual. And she said, you know, we really felt like we continue to be on the outside, and we continue to have to fight for what was right and what was safe. And it wasn't just, you know, they're there, girls, we'll take care of it.
Mhm. We have a question asking your opinion on right to try legislation, which the questioner says basically cuts the FDA out of the review of compassionate use.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
Is the questioner here? So
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the right to try legislation myself. Why don't I ask a different question, and then we can come back to this. The person that asked that, if you could expand on a little bit. My question was about the thalidomide cases that Kelsey wasn't able to control in the United States. You
Yeah.
described doctors that were, you know, getting thalidomide that they weren't able to prescribe, but they were able to give away for free. And so there was this sort of underground market in the United States in which many people did take thalidomide, but not in a prescription basis. Could you talk about that story and Kelsey's response to it?
It's a fine line about the prescription basis. Would you call it a prescription if a doctor gives you a drug?
Hmm.
I think what this was is that the loophole was that drugs in the original trials process were allowed to be given to doctors to try for trials. So these were called the trials set. But they kept, many of the doctors kept very sloppy or indifferent records of who they gave the drug to. Often, and some of them said, oh, well, we had the salesman come and gave us this drug, and so he said it was really good, and so I just gave it to my patients, and like candy, basically. And there were a few that actually didn't, hopefully. Some said they actually didn't. But there was really no proper regulation from the drug company down that the people that were prescribing these drugs as trial drugs were not researchers, they were salesmen. They were going around, I say men because they were at this point all men. They were going around to doctors, giving the drugs, giving the hype, and telling them to use, you know, give it to the patients. And of course, the most reprehensible ones was when they gave it to OBGYNs, because they are giving specifically to pregnant women or women who could be pregnant. So yeah, there was an awful lot of drugs out there that was seen part of this loophole, and that was because there wasn't proper testing or follow-up in terms of testing at this stage.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from the audience about Kelsey's reception in the academic community. Do you think that the academic community has recognized her contributions adequately or not?
That is a really good question. The academic community, I think it's, well, you know, I mean, it's only been in the last 30 years as we start having more and more stories about the significance of women in many different professions and their stories being told that they get accepted. I think I think the fact that there is so much interest in Dr. Kelsey, I think that I know that over the years, because I've seen it in the records, there have been many researchers who were getting, you know, who wanted to do studies on her, or who did, but they were overwhelmed by the records, might have been overwhelmed by some of the technical reports, and seeing that this wasn't an easy job to do. I think that one thing that was funny, that kind of, there's a loophole there as well, about her personal fame, what's very huge and then would disappear and then sort of percolate around, was the fact that she still worked for the FDA for most of her life, which meant she wasn't writing her biography or memoir. She wasn't going on the talk show circuit. She
Mhm.
still worked for the government. And so therefore, there's only so much she could say. And she wasn't a huge self-promoter. So that she I think that aspect of it, the fact that it was always very contained what she could say, um, sort of the story would disappear, and it did disappear. But in the academic realm, in the history of medicine realm and science, I mean, she's definitely recognized.
Mhm. We have a clarification on that right to try
Okay.
question. So the clarification, right to try legislation provides a pathway to access non-approved drugs without FDA approval, whereas previously such access required FDA approval. Do you have concerns about this?
Oh, that's what I was a little bit confused about, is that there was the idea of compassionate drug. There always was, because I know that there were instances where there was a child dying of cancer, and so Dr. Kelsey was able to get permission and gave permission that the drug company could give specifically to that family. And there was
Mhm.
one very complicated one where they gave it to a Russian scientist's child
Mm.
during the Cold War, and it all had to go through the State Department and the rest of it. So there always was that loophole. The problem was, and I think, you know, it's, if it's done properly, absolutely, as it has been. The problem was when it was exploited by some of the marketers, such as the people who were dealing with Laetrile, people who were dealing with some other things that turned out to be more quack remedies. They would get patients to send letters, you know, by the hundreds to congressmen and to other politicians in the FDA, and it was all really orchestrated, and it was really to sell their drug.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, as long as it's done, I think it's very important, but I think there always was that. I don't know about the drug legislation today, whether they still have that loophole, but I know that she dealt with it.
Yeah. We have a request for you to elaborate a little bit more on Kelsey's early life. What would you like listeners to know, especially about her childhood?
Thank you very much. That's my favorite part of the book. Okay, so Dr. Kelsey came from here on Vancouver Island, which is kind of a unique part of Canada because it was the way I look at what I called it was the superhighway that was the Pacific Ocean. That when you had settlers that were coming into Ontario and cutting down the trees and pioneers in the West, first there was a population on Vancouver Island that was from the British military, that, you know, the Spanish were here, the Russians were here, but the British, many of the pensioned off military, the Redcoats, would settle in Vancouver Island. And so you had this enclave of educated, often gentrified expats, British, that would establish their own little private schools, which is why she still had a vestige of a British accent, even though she lived so many years in the States and she was Canadian. And so it was another little world out here. And her mother was from a prosperous Scottish family. Her father was English. They were, you know, the mother was well educated. The father was an intellectual, and they. What I found most charming of all stories was that the mother was, I must say, she was in some ways a helicopter mom when she had to be. I live really close to the biological station. I can see it out of my window. And during the Depression, the mother wanted her to come back from Montreal, from McGill, and get a job there in Canada. And And so she found, there was this biological station that's just, right down the road, 40 miles down the road, and there's no job for her daughter. And she came, the mother came, and she fought it out with the head, the poor man. And he said, well, if the government in Ottawa would give us more money, we would have places to put all these students that should be hired like your daughter. Right. So she had, long story short, she had an awful lot of family support for what she did. And so she had, in many ways, a very charmed, in some ways, youth. Yeah.
This is quite a different topic, but we have not talked about the early development of thalidomide and its links to Nazi medical experimentation. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's something that when you hear about first, you're shocked, and then you think, well, obviously. I read some work that was done later, and that there were a few members of the board of Grunenthal, the company Chemie Grunenthal, that had actually been in the SS. One of them had been involved in creating nerve gas that was used in the concentration camp. So you couldn't get any worse than this. And so naturally, why not make a poison and unleash it on the population? There's not, I haven't been able to find specifically, but there was some hints, and I don't know how true this is, that the original research might have been done in the camps on concentration camp victims that were there. There were other drugs that had that kind of sordid history. But the members of the board, they poisoned their own staff. I mean, their own staff's children were among the first that had the drug and that had deformities, and they just denied everything. They said, no, this isn't caused by that. That's not what it's from. Maybe it's from radiation or something from the war or whatever. So they really had, the just lack of moral fiber. And then at the time, one of the doctors who was involved, Whittingham Lenz, who was one of the first researchers that discovered the link with the child defects, what he said was that the company will get off. There won't be any big lawsuits because the drug company is just too big an economic engine in Germany at the time. So yeah, it's a horrific story. On the other hand, in some ways, you kind of want all evil to be in one place. And so that's where it came, and I mean, in a real perverse way. One of the writers of letters said, well, do you think that the drug was really the Russians' way to in the Cold War to unleash defects on American children? And I'm thinking, well, it was the Germans, right? They lost the war, but look what they unleashed on everybody else after the war. So yeah, it's not a happy story, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I hate to end things on that note, but I think we are just about out of time, and I'm not seeing any extra questions. So I think, Loretta, we can go ahead and wrap things up.
Yes, thank you so much, Cheryl Krasnick Warsh, for joining us today to discuss your new book, Francis Oldham Kelsey, the FDA, and the Battle Against Thalidomide. I think we all learned a great deal from you about Dr. Kelsey and about pharmacology. If you're interested in learning more about research in the manuscript division, please check out our website for more information or submit a question to ask.loc.gov/manuscripts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.